Welcome back to this series of lectures on the theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior. This is part 3, and here we're just focusing on subjective norms. And the pattern for discussing and measuring subjective norms is really much the same as it is for attitudes. So if you sort of understand that process, this will reinforce it. If you're fuzzy on the previous process or fuzzy on how we use attitudes, maybe this will clarify it. So, subjective norms. What we're talking about here is for a given behavior, what are other people's opinion of you engaging this behavior? And part 2 of that is, how much do you care about their opinion? Because there are times we've heard the advice of experts or professionals, or the advice of parents or family, of friends, and we might respect those people generally, but in a particular case, we may not care about their opinion. Or in other cases, we may suddenly be very interested in their opinion, right? So that's what subjective norm does. It says, what is the opinion that other people have about this behavior? Other people in your life, what opinion do they have about the behavior? And do you care? Does that opinion make any difference to you? So just like with attitudes, there are two elements we're going to be looking at. The first element we're looking at is normative beliefs. And I put in parentheses there, reference. That's a not reference, but reference. The TS there, I can't pronounce it very clearly. And that's the people whose opinion we're going to be talking about, right? So a referent might be your parent, a referent might be your friend, it might be a colleague, it might be your boss, right? So that's what a referent is. And so we're asking, how do they evaluate the behavior? And we're using a scale of -3 to +3. Again, it should look very familiar to attitudes, right? My blank would think it's good would give us a +3. My blank would think it's bad would be a -3. So we could put in there, my best friend would think, I say it's, whatever the behavior is. My best friend would think trying this illegal substance is good, or my best friend would think trying this illegal substance is bad, right? That's the normative belief. And we're going to score for each person that we're listing as a referent. How do we think that they evaluate the behavior from a +3 to a -3? Then we ask the really important question of our motivation to comply. Do we care what our best friend thinks about this? Or on this topic, do we think they don't know any better, or they're an idiot? I mean, I don't know, right? Just like, again, if you're in your teen years, there might have been times that you decided that or there were times that you knew exactly what your parents thought about a behavior, but you had really no motivation to comply. You weren't really interested in their opinion of a certain behavior, right? Or certain medical professionals, you don't care what they say about the diet you have because darn it, that food is good, right? You don't care that it's deep fried. So at the extreme, I care about their opinion as a 7. I don't care at all about their opinion as a 1. And just as before, we go and we multiply those. So if we're talking about whether or not you should stop at the drive-through to pick up some lunch, and drive-throughs notoriously are not very healthy food, it may be that we're talking about your physician, right? My MD, right? Would think, well, they probably wouldn't think it's good. Actually, they'd probably say it was bad, and they might say, well, it's not the worst thing you could do, but it's not a very good choice, so it's a -2. But you might think, yeah, but they're a fuddy-duddy. They blow things out of proportion. My motivation to comply with them, it could be I respect them, but I think that they're not always really on point. So then you give them a 3 out of a possible 7, which isn't very high, right? So if we go and we multiply those by each other, right, that comes out to being a -6, which means that you are more likely than, right, there's very little effect there in terms of not going through the drive-through. They think it's a bad idea. You only sort of care about their opinion. So it is discouraging you, dissuading you from the drive-through, but not by a whole lot, right? So what I did there is I multiplied the normative belief by the motivation to comply, and that gave us our subjective norm component. Just as with attitude, we'll have components. So we'll have each person is going to be a component. So if we're talking about health decisions, a medical professional would be a component perhaps. Uh, Close family members might be listed as a component. Friends may be listed as a component, right? Those are, right, individually we'd look at how do we feel about that particular referent, their opinion, or what do we believe their opinion is, and what's our motivation to comply, right? And it's pretty important that we're going to talk about that in a little bit. About this is what do we think their opinion is, because we may be wrong, right? So we multiply that normative belief by the motivation to comply, as you saw me do the math for, and then we're going to add up all of those components together, and that gives us a total score for a subjective norm. Let's look at how we would go about measuring these. The process then for measuring subjective norms looks much like the process for measuring attitudes. We start by evaluating the normative belief, right? So my partner, and if we're talking about the condom example, right, from attitudes, my partner would blank of using a condom. Strongly disapprove or strongly approve, -3 to a +3. And then we ask about motivation to comply. My partner's approval of condoms is blank to me, which is extremely unimportant to extremely important. Right? And you can see then how that would work out. We can just imagine if we run those numbers again for this case, very quickly if we run those numbers, you can see how if a person felt that their partner's opinion was very important to them, and they believed, rightly or wrongly, they believed their partner disapproved, well, that score there, right, that ends up being, right, -2 times 6, that's a -12. That's not great, right? That is a number suggesting that this person is less likely now to use a condom when they feel they should, right? So this would be one for that condom example. Let's look at the recycling example that I use with attitudes. So again, normative belief. My friends blank of recycling water bottles. So they strongly disapprove or they strongly approve. And then what's our motivation to comply? So our friends may be all about recycling. So let's say that they are. Let's say we have friends who are all about recycling. It's a +3. What's our motivation to comply? Right? My friend's approval of recycling is blank to me. And you may decide that your friends, you like them and everything, but you don't care that much about what they think. Well, that gives a score then, a total score of a 6, right? Because we drew from that 2 and that 3, that gives, multiplying those together is a score of a 6. That is at least some support. But of course, if it had been a 7, it would be a 21. So 6 is a low to moderate, sort of encouraging you to recycle, which means when you're around them, maybe you're more likely to do it then. Right? Because there is a little bit of motivation to comply, but they're so strong. Where you could see if we were to go and change a couple of these numbers, right? Let's say your friends, they just sort of approve of recycling water bottles. Well, when we bring those together then, it's just a 2. Right? Whereas before it had been a 6. So it's even weaker effect. And so now maybe if your friends are around and you have a water bottle to recycle, maybe even you're going to be even less likely to do it, right? That assumes these numbers are accurate, right? So that's how we measure subjective norms. Let's look at a chart for another example, just like with attitudes, and see how these numbers work out. So I'm using again the case of texting, and for the reference, right? I listed a referent of your mom, friend, and a professor, right? Those are the referents. I can never say that quite right. Okay. So what is it that they believe about texting and driving? On a scale from -3 to positive, your mother thinks it's not a very good idea, it's -2. Your friend thinks it's a perfectly good idea, +2. And your professor thinks it's a terrible idea, -3. Well, now we have to ask, how much do you care about their opinion? Because the professor is a -3. So that should be worth something. But is it worth? Well, you really respect, look at you. Look what a good boy or girl you are, right? I'm only a sort of good boy, so you're probably better than me, right? But your motivation to comply with what your mother believes is a +6. Actually, I remember the time that I was driving and my mom said, I notice you keep pushing lights that are turning yellow. They're rather close to red. I think you should be more careful. I was 20-something years old, and I remember that voice being in my head. It affected me. I had a certain motivation to comply. Anyway, so your mother says that texting and driving is not a very good idea. It's a -2. You have a fairly strong motivation to comply. It's a +6. You're a little bit less likely to comply with your friends, which is a 4. And your professor has the least effect of all, a -3. So as we out, right? When again, show you about the importance here of multiplying. I'll use a different color than what I've been using, right? So your mother was a -2, your professor had been a -3, but then compare those numbers. Your mom has the total effect of a -12 versus a -6. has to do with that power multiplication. And the difference, of course, had to do with the fact that your professor's opinion you only sort of vaguely care about, whereas you very strongly care about your mother's opinion. Right? And so we would go through, we add all of those scores up, right? We go through, add everything in this column, we add it together, and it gives us a score of a -10. So that -10 is relative. If we remind ourselves of what the possible scores were, right? So your mother, if we go back up here for a second, right, your mother's at -12 out of a possible of -21 or positive 21. That's a moderate discouragement to do it, right? Your friend is a little bit of a encouragement to do it, +8 out of a possible of 21, and your professor's a -6, having the least effect. Overall, then what we see is a score of a -10. It could be better. It could be a -63, in which you feel like all forces are encouraging you to not text and drive. But of course, it could be much worse because at least the number is not positive, right? So it's a -10, which means there, in terms of subjective norms, the people around you who you care about, you are vaguely discouraged from texting and driving. Out of a possible -63, it's only -10, so it's a fairly mild discouragement to text and drive. Now, what do we do with these numbers? So if we use those numbers from before, right, my friends think texting and driving is a 2, my motivation to comply with them is a 4. I think it's what I had on the previous screen. If not, please go along with me, right? We can chart those out, right? There's one chart, right? That would be the normative belief, and there's our motivation to comply. So we see on the scale of things where things fit. Motivation to comply is sort of the middle of the road. The normative belief is a little bit stronger. We can attack these or come at these really individually, right? One of the things we can do is change the person's perception of what the referent thinks. So we had said that their friend's opinion of texting and driving was a 2. Remember that we'd said it was a 2. But one of the things we can do is perhaps affect what a person thinks their peers believe about a behavior. I saw a sign in a stairwell at ETSU one time, and it said, "This weekend, 80% of ETSU students will have 2 or fewer drinks." Right? What it was doing there in talking about alcohol is trying to help you reframe what you might think is your peers' opinion about drinking. That your peers' opinions are not thinking that you should go out there and be going crazy and drinking like a fish on the weekend, because 80% of students on the weekend are probably going to have 2 drinks or fewer that weekend. I want to say the number was 2. It could have been 3, but I think it was 2, and it actually was for the weekend, right? So it's trying to change what do you think, right? Change your perception, right? Let me underscore that. Change your perception of the referent. Because just because you think your friends expect you to do something doesn't mean it's actually what they're expecting you to do, right? So we're going to change the perception of the referent's opinion. That's one thing we can do. Things like when you don't text and drive, your friends see you as a leader. When you don't text and drive, your friends see you as more mature, right? That would be a way, a campaign maybe that would look at changing a perception of the referent's opinion. Conversely, or maybe not conversely, but the other hand of that is we could change our concern for their opinion, right? This sort of, you think about what your parents used to say to you, or whoever, whoever used to say to you, if your friends jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? That's what we're saying. Change how much you want to follow this other person's opinion. So do you really need to care about your friend's choices? So maybe a campaign that emphasizes your friends may be nice people, maybe they make lots of dumb choices. Do you really want to listen to what they say about texting and driving? Right? Okay, that might be a terrible campaign or way to come at it, but you get at what I'm saying. That if we can change how much people care about a given person's opinion, right? And just as with attitudes, in the end, full analysis may tell us that subjective norms doesn't mean very much. There may be strong subjective norms discouraging a behavior or encouraging a behavior, but it may be attitude or it may be perceived behavioral control that really matters, and subjective norms don't. So we'll be looking at a little bit later, but right now, this is subjective norms. And when you look at subjective norms and attitudes together, that in total is the theory of reasoned action, or TRA. And to review, That's the attitude toward behavior, subjective norms, and they don't predict behavior, they predict behavioral intention. And behavioral intention is predictive of behavior. So that's the theory of reasoned action. It looks at just attitude toward behavior and subjective norm as predictive of intention. And intention is the best indicator of actual behavior.